Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are embarking on a really incredible immersive journey into the sensory reality of the 13th century. We're going to reconstruct an entire human world here, but we aren't going to do it by looking through the distant, cold gaze of kings and generals. No, we're going to look at it through the calloused hands, the daily meals, and the bustling, often chaotic lives of ordinary people. We're going to examine exactly how geography, the changing of the seasons, rigid social hierarchies, and these massive, formidable institutions structured their very existence, literally from cradle to grave.
You know, the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously brushed off the lives of our medieval ancestors as simply nasty, brutish, and short. Well, today we are going to challenge that modern assumption. While their lives were absolutely bounded by intense physical constraints, the ever-present threat of disease, and some incredibly strict, unforgiving social structures, they were also rich with resilience, community, and deeply complex systems of survival and learning. So we're going to temporarily inhabit their time. We want to really feel the mud beneath their feet and the cold wind against their faces. And we'll start with the most basic, driving force of all: survival.
Part 1. Sustenance and Survival. In what was a heavily stratified society, daily life for the vast majority of people was structured around the relentless, rhythmic pursuit of just getting enough to eat. Eating wasn't some gourmet adventure, it was a daily, desperate calculation of survival. The caloric and sensory realities of this era were starkly divided by class. If you were a peasant, or honestly a destitute university student, your diet was a repetitive, earthy cycle. We're talking coarse brown bread, a bubbling, smoky cauldron of thin oat or bean pottage, boiled tripe, and bitter ale. But then, conversely, the wealthy and the nobility, they dined in a completely different sensory world. They were feasting on heavily peppered pork pies, spit-roasted pigeons just dripping with fat, fine-spiced wine, and fresh garden vegetables. Food was, without a doubt, the most visible, tangible marker of a person's worth. But actually, geography and climate, way more than human choice, were the true, unforgiving masters of the medieval diet. A peasant's daily meal shifted dramatically with the turning of the earth and the dying of the light. Right after the autumn harvest of Michaelmas, the hearth briefly smelled of fresh grain bread, pork from newly slaughtered livestock, and earthy garden greens. But fast forward to late winter, that vibrant diet dwindled down to the harsh textures of stale, tooth-breaking bread, watery bone broth, and heavily salted or smoked meats. You basically choked down whatever the larder could supply just to survive until spring. Part 2. The Rise of the Towns. Now, for centuries, most of Western Europe lived out in isolated, self-sustaining manorial estates, surrounded by quiet forests and fields. But in the High Middle Ages, a massive surge in commerce birthed the medieval town. And this was a chaotic cacophony of shouting merchants, ringing blacksmith anvils, and the pungent smells of raw leather, wood smoke, and just crowded humanity. Serfs realized they could flock to these emerging, muddy urban centers and actually earn coin through skilled labor, paying their lords in cash instead of traditional, back-breaking feudal service.
Of course, this rapid urban boom required some rigid structure, which gave rise to the powerful craft guilds. Medieval labor progressed through a highly systematic, lifelong journey. You'd start as an apprentice, living in a master's household under strict, often harsh domestic training. Once you matured, you became a journeyman, earning daily wages and frequently heading out on a multi-year voyage across Europe known as the Wanderjahre. Finally, by passing a rigorous guild examination and submitting a flawless masterpiece, you could become a master. And make no mistake, these guilds maintained an absolute, iron-fisted monopoly on trade. They dictated exactly who had the right to earn a living.
This unprecedented concentration of skilled labor and commercial wealth ended up creating an entirely new social demographic, the burgher class. These merchants and master craftsmen grew so influential that they actually rivaled the ancient nobility in the luxury of their stone dwellings and the clergy in their hunger for education. To meet their highly practical, everyday needs, like complex reckoning for business accounting and written literacy for international trade, they paved the way for civic control of education. By establishing burgher and guild schools, this new middle class fractured the church's ancient, total monopoly on learning, a real game changer.
Part 3. Cloisters and Convents. We really can't understand the medieval mind without understanding the life of the spirit. So let's shift our gaze away from the noisy, mud-slicked streets of the merchant towns and look at the isolated, deliberate silence of those who prayed. Behind high stone walls, the cloisters and convents offered a vastly different sensory reality, operating on a completely separate rhythm from the chaos of the secular world outside.
Monastic life was defined by this quiet, unyielding rhythm of devotion and labor. Just imagine the distinct scent of fresh animal parchment, burning beeswax candles, and the damp chill of cold stone beneath sandaled feet. Monks weren't just praying all day, they were the ultimate preservers of human knowledge, painstakingly copying illuminated manuscripts in absolute, echoing silence. And beyond the scriptorium, they managed heavy agricultural labor, taught young oblates, and served as the primary social safety net of the time. They provided crucial health care, orphan aid, and daily alms to the local poor.
But as these institutions evolved, so did the strict constraints placed upon women. For centuries, elite women had actually found immense authority and intellectual freedom by running vast, wealthy convent estates as powerful abbesses. However, as the church became increasingly centralized in the 1300s, a succession of popes ordered that male authorities had to oversee convents. Nuns were strictly cloistered, basically forbidden by law to ever leave the convent grounds. Yet, here's the fascinating part. Despite being physically restricted to these stone enclosures, these women adapted brilliantly, and they continued to provide essential, high-level education for young girls and invaluable health care for their communities.
Part 4. The Medieval Student Experience. So while the rural monasteries represented a life of quiet contemplation, a very different kind of educational revolution was erupting right in the heart of the cities. We're moving now to the raucous, entirely uncloistered environment of the newly formed universities. In places like the Latin Quarter of Paris, that pious, deliberate monastic silence was completely shattered by the chaotic, vibrant, and often dangerous freedom of thousands of young men crowding into lecture halls and taverns.
The intellectual architecture of these new universities rested firmly upon the 7 liberal arts. Students first had to master the trivium, which was the foundational triad of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. After that, they advanced to the complex mathematical realities of the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And this wasn't just learning for learning's sake, right? This grueling, rigorous curriculum was specifically and strategically designed to prepare these students to become highly skilled clerks, lawyers, and administrators for the ever-expanding bureaucratic machinery of the Catholic Church.
Now, how was all this knowledge transmitted? Through a rigorous, highly structured methodology known as lectio. This wasn't mere rote memorization. Instead, the master would read an authoritative passage aloud to the crowded room, and then launch into a highly detailed, critical commentary. It was an active, intellectually demanding exploration of nuance, contradiction, and meaning. This practice literally formed the foundation of the scholastic method, an analytical framework that fundamentally transformed how knowledge was absorbed and, honestly, still profoundly influences higher education today.
However, we have to be careful not to overly romanticize these medieval scholars. Remember, they were often as young as 13 or 14, away from their families for the first time, and they fully embraced the visceral temptations of urban independence. Historical records are just overflowing with local complaints about rampant gambling, violent tavern brawls, and excessive drinking. And as a testament to the unchanging nature of youth, the university archives are packed with desperate letters from students begging their wealthy parents for more money to buy quote-unquote expensive books. Yeah, history strongly suspects those funds went straight to the local taverns.
Part 5. Town, Gown, and Riot. You take this intoxicating mix of youthful arrogance, immense institutional privilege, and dense urban proximity, and it inevitably laid the groundwork for severe conflict. Which brings us to a gripping historical climax. This is the moment where the systemic legal protections of the church violently collided with secular local authorities right in the blood-stained, muddy streets of medieval Paris.
Let's break down exactly what happened. In March 1229, during the rowdy pre-Lenten carnival season, a completely mundane dispute over a tavern tab for sweet wine sparked a brutal brawl. The very next day, armed students returned in a mob, destroying the establishment and assaulting citizens. Because the local city guard could not legally arrest the scholars, Queen Blanche, the regent of France, deployed brutal mercenaries who violently struck down several students. The university masters were absolutely outraged. In response, they triggered their ultimate economic weapon. They suspended all lectures, went on a massive strike, and completely abandoned the city of Paris for 2 full years. To really understand why the Queen's violent intervention was viewed by the academics as a profound, systemic violation, we have to talk about the benefit of clergy. See, students were technically recognized as part of the church. They wore tonsured hair and clerical robes. This explicitly meant they were entirely exempt from the local king's courts. They could only be tried by ecclesiastical courts, which were notoriously lenient on their own scholars. This legal loophole made the students virtually untouchable by city authorities, and as you can imagine, it sparked immense simmering resentment between the secular town and the academic gown.
So the university leaves, and this 2-year dispersion places such a crippling economic strain on the city of Paris that the Pope himself, who was an alumnus of the institution, by the way, was forced to intervene from Rome. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX issued the Parens Scientiarum. It's widely celebrated as the Magna Carta of the University of Paris. This remarkable document permanently enshrined academic freedom by placing the university directly under papal patronage. It guaranteed their absolute independence from local secular authorities and officially weaponized their right to strike if those academic freedoms were ever violated again.
Which brings us to our final reflection today. We look back across the centuries at these medieval people, eating their humble pottage, laboring fiercely in their closed guilds, chanting in the icy quiet of their cloisters, and rioting in the muddy streets to defend their academic independence against systemic overreach. 8 centuries later, as the fragile boundaries of academic freedom, institutional privilege, and fierce student protests continue to make daily headlines in our own time, we are forced to ask, are we truly so different from the striking students of 1229? The past is never just a distant land, it's a mirror reflecting our own unbroken human nature. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.